It's too cold to ride today and there's snow everywhere, so I'm gonna do another bike check. I've been getting a number of questions from you guys, and yeah, hopefully this will clear some of those up. The reason why I built this bike up in the first place is because the bike that I wanted did not exist. I started out as a trials rider. I rode competition trials for a while, but then I really got into freestyle BMX, and I wanted to combine trials with BMX riding. I got a 24-inch, and the 24-inch trials bikes, in my opinion, just did not ride well. They weren't any good for trials, and they weren't any good for BMX. They couldn't do either of them. After my failed attempt at getting into 24-inch street trials, I just bought a dirt jumper, because I was like, oh, whatever, I'm not going to do trials anymore. Let's just ride some dirt jumps and get big air. And that bike, it was a Specialized P3. It rode ridiculously well. Suddenly, I did not want to ride any other bike ever. What happened to the P3 is I started to do some tech stuff on it, some trials, and the rear end kept getting loose and blowing up on it. So I had to get rid of the P3, and it was time to build up a new bike. I was doing lots of shows for the circus, so I wanted to be able to do trials on it. So I ended up looking at a bunch of dirt jumpers and trying to find one that had a strong rear end, something that would hold up to a strong disc brake and rear wheel moves. So I ended up with the Trek Ticket. Everybody knows how good this bike is as a dirt jumper. Emilio Hansen, Brett Reeder, Brandon Semenuk, those guys kill it. So obviously it's one of the best bikes in the world for dirt jumps, but put disc brakes front and rear on it and it becomes a pretty darn good trials bike. I'm not 100% sure on the numbers on this, but off the top of my head, it has a couple centimeters bottom bracket drop, a 69-degree head angle. I'm fairly certain it's about 400 millimeter chainstays, so they're quite long. And the wheelbase, I don't really care. Moving on to the front end, it's a Rockshox Pike front fork, 100 millimeter travel. I run the fork at full pressure with 1 click of rebound. The compression settings change depending on what I'm riding. If I'm riding trials, I actually run it a little bit softer, and if I'm running park or dirt jumps, I'll run it very firm so that I don't lose any pop off of jumps. The front suspension was necessary because my body is getting old. My elbows, my shoulders, my wrists, they don't like impact anymore. And believe it or not, having front suspension makes a huge difference on my legs as well. When the fork compresses, the bottom bracket does drop a little bit, so you get a little bit of suspension for your knees and your ankles if you're landing two wheels a lot, like I do. On the front end, I did make a change to the handlebar. I was running a Spank handlebar, but it had way too much flex, so I moved to a Chromag OSX and cut them down to 730 millimeters. And those have been amazing, very stiff. The stem is going on 5 years old now. It's a Spank Spike 35 millimeter stem. Grips, I've only ever run ODI Longnecks, and I am not going to another grip because those are the best. I have a drilled out top cap so that I can run the front brake hose through the steerer tube. That way I can do as many bar spins as I want. I generally like a high bar height, just so that it's easy to get the front wheel off the ground and so that I stay in an upright position. The saddle is a Chromag Overture saddle. I hopped on the bandwagon. Everybody was running those because everybody loved the way Brandon Semenuk made them look. It's easy to pinch, it's soft, and as you can see, it's beat up a little bit, but it's not nearly ready to be changed. I'm going to keep running this probably for another year. The cranks that I'm running are Truvativ Descendant cranks. These are not the strongest crank out there. I have actually already bent one pair. The way that I bent these cranks, it was actually in a foam pit. I was pumping hard to pick up speed, and when I got to the bottom of the transition, I felt them go. There's some new ones on there, and so far they've been good. They are 170 mils in length. I decided to go a little bit shorter for catching tail whips. That way, when I catch the tail whip, my feet don't have to move as far from the spindle to the pedal to get back on the pedals. I tend to catch the spindle instead of the actual pedal itself. Behind the front sprocket, I run a Crankstopper. It's old tire cut up and jammed in between the crank and the bash guard, and that stops the cranks when I'm doing tail whips. There is a bash guard on there. It's an MRP designed for up to 30 teeth, and yeah, it doesn't protect my chain completely. I still hit my chain when I mess up, but it keeps it from being an impact hard enough to do damage to the chain and to the sprocket. So it's done the job. When e-bikes first came out, I knew I wanted to try out some of their drivetrain stuff because it's designed for higher torque, and in trials you put an insane amount of torque on your drivetrain. So the KMC e-bike chain, it hasn't snapped, it hasn't broken. I'm happy with it. Deity TMAC pedals, yeah, I am not going to buy any other pedal for as long as they make these because they're super stiff, unbelievable amount of grip, and I'm never going to run another pedal. Continuing on from the drivetrain, we'll go back to the rear hub. It is an Industry 9 Hydra hub, the one with 600 engagement points. I spent a lot of money on this, and I was worried because they haven't been proven on a trials bike. In the couple years that I've been riding it, it has not skipped once. I run 2 gears on the back of the bike, 1 gear for going fast and 1 gear for doing tricks and doing trials. The chain tensioner I use is a Trial Tech single-sided tensioner. This way, when I'm changing gears from trials mode to get places mode, I can slip this on without breaking the chain. The Trek Ticket has horizontal dropouts on it, so when I'm in my trials gear, I can slide the axle back and run it as a single speed with no chain tensioner. A 28 tooth sprocket up front and a 22 in the back for trials is pretty similar to the standard trials gear, which is 2218 or 1815. And for getting places, I have a 12 tooth on the back from Chris King, and I've done 15-kilometer rides to get to a single spot, and this gear is amazing for that. Onto the wheels. For the rear wheel, it's a Spank Spike 35mm wide rim. I've had this for a long time. I honestly cannot believe how long this rim is lasting. I've landed flares terribly, sure that it was going to taco, and it's still straight. Moving on to the front wheel. It's a Hope Pro 4 front hub laced to a Stans Flow MK3 front rim. It's light. The rim is definitely not the strongest one out there. I would not run this rim on the back, but for the front, it does the job. It's light enough that I can do those tricks, do those bar spins and spins of all sorts, and it does not hold me back. The tires have changed over the years. I went from a super light dirt jump tire to a enduro tire, and now I'm back to something kind of in the middle. It's the Maxxis Ikon. This tire is designed for cross-country racing, but it is very light, and it doesn't have that papery thin sidewall that dirt jump tires often have. So it does provide a little bit of support. For tire pressure, about 40 psi front and rear is what I usually go for. Sometimes I'll go softer in the front, down to 30, just to save my wrists a little bit. I ran them tubeless for a while, but I kept burping them when doing gaps, so they have tubes in them now. Brakes are one of the most important things on a trials setup, and I've had my issues with Shimano. Magura isn't super popular where I am, so that kind of brought me to Sram. I haven't had any issues with leaking or with the pistons getting seized like a lot of people say they have with Sram brakes. They do make a little bit of noise sometimes. As far as power goes, they are amazing. They are the Sram code brakes, 180mm rotors front and rear. A lot of trials riders run 200s, but really that's not necessary. Brakes have gotten so good now.
180 mil rotors are great, and because they're slightly smaller in diameter, they stay out of the way of rocks and ledges and things that you might break a rotor on. What I would change is the geometry. I would run shorter chainstays and a slightly higher bottom bracket. Maybe 0mm bottom bracket drop and 380mm chainstays. That way it would make rear wheel moves quite a bit easier. The cranks could be stronger. The Truvativ Descendant cranks, like I said, I've bent them. The bash guard, I wish it was a little bit more beefy. Those are the things that could make this bike perfect. On this bike, I've done about 200 circus shows. I've filmed a ton of videos up for my YouTube channel, and I also got injured quite a few times and had some bad crashes on it. So it's been through a lot. I'm gonna keep riding this as soon as the snow melts, and I hope you guys are stoked to get out too. So I'll see you around.